I'm going to talk to you something about that I've worked on for several years, and several years have gone by, allowing the memory of it to fade enough that I could talk to you again about it. Looking for some maybe bigger lessons. This is the most eloquent part of my talk probably, but the poet says we're going to go back and we're going to know the place for the first time. You know, this, and I find this stage kind of awkward. You know, if you ever had bad concert seats on one side of the auditorium or the other, you know how the performers will move from one wing to the other? So I'm going to kind of do that. What? Of course, everyone has a copy of their book, as they should in their library, right? Things we're going to talk about today include calibration with PEST. This is the PEST conference. We're going to talk about conceptual and parameter uncertainty with PEST. We're going to talk about Monte Carlo transport. We're going to talk about a peer review. We're going to talk about validation. We're going to talk about model conservatism. We're going to talk about quality assurance, regulatory acceptance, success factors, and then we're going to wrap it up. Needless to say, maybe it won't be like in great detail about each one, right? So let me give you the background here. Some of you have seen these kind of pictures before. This is looking north into a place called Frenchman Flat. It's in southern Nevada. Las Vegas is about 70 miles this way. That picture's taken from about, and here is about my recollection. This site called, I prefer the Nevada test site. They've tried to give it a much nicer name. Was used for above ground and underground nuclear testing during the Cold War. These underground nuclear tests left behind radioactive residue. Is it in the groundwater? Is it a threat? Was the whole purpose of this project? And we use site characterization modeling to negotiate compliance boundaries and to try to get a decision. So what happens near an underground nuclear test, just because not everyone cares about this or has studied this, you know, I certainly didn't. So when the device goes off, of course, you know, there's a fireball and heat. Everything gets vaporized. There's compressed or fracturing of the rock. Everything is very hot and molten. You get it this, as things cool down, the pressure subsides, the rock falls back into the cavity. There's alteration of rock properties. We'll chat just briefly about that. The exchange volume, where the radionuclides are around the cavity. And as things cool down, you get preferential distribution. The higher boiling point, think uranium radionuclides come out first. They are incorporated in nuclear melt glass, a fancy name for melted rock. And then the other stuff, think about tritium, comes out in the vapor and sticks in the water. And at least because, you know, our conference talks about data, we had a lot of data, but some of it, of different kinds. And I'm going to tell you later on that it wasn't some of the right type. But you can see we wrote a lot of reports here. I didn't put Keith Halford's up here. Maybe this is one of his, but anyway. So yeah, Keith is a collaborator on this project. We even had so many documents, we wrote an overview document about the documents that we wrote. And we still didn't have the right data, I think you would conclude at the end of it. That's a bit of a foreshadowing. As we're going to go through and talk about Frenchman Flat, I've got like 4 waypoints where we're going to talk about bigger issues that generally you find, or certainly you've been hear about, you know, for instance, this one, when we talk about modeling. 15, 20 years ago, it was a lot less common to hear, oh, we need to consider our conceptual model uncertainty. And this project kind of kicked off in the mid-2000s. It was a little unusual at the time because it required both these elements of uncertainty to be addressed. From my perspective, this particular document, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, I can't remember the document number, kind of was the seminal document. It talks about it at length. It also talks about this thing, maximum likelihood model Bayesian averaging, and we'll talk about that just briefly. So I really am going to touch a lot of things, but maybe not in a lot of depth. John Bredehoeft wrote this paper in 2005, says that we should leave our conceptual model open to change. He didn't say that this makes a model useless, but maybe we're not catching all the uncertainty that we should. Eileen Potter said, well, maybe we should actually consider this as well, but defining the alternatives could be difficult, and I would tell you that I think that's true, but it could be a lot of different sources of things. And lastly, coming back a longer way, this guy, Chamberlain, 125 years ago, suggested multiple working hypotheses anyway. And if you want to consider a model as a hypothesis of how the system works, then maybe you should have more than one, just as good practice. So now we'll go to this side of the stage. The conceptual model uncertainty in this project was kind of assumed to mostly lie within the geologic framework. You'll notice here that the depth of the framework, and this isn't even all of it, this is 2,600 meters. And the testing was typically done at a horizon like this, and yet we're carrying around all of this, and we'll just chat about that briefly. And our uncertainty often exists in areas that are data poor, and sometimes maybe don't matter. And we had 4 of these. We're gonna come up on this. But, but as we got into it, and this is part about having an open mind, being open to possibilities, when we implemented our first framework model, we saw that this particular test had this little thin strip of this welded tuff. And that, as you'll see, turns out to be a transport pathway, possibly. But when you stand on the ground here and you look at the mountains, even a mediocre geologist like myself can quite clearly see the faults. The question is, well, do those faults come down and cut that pathway? So there was one that we hadn't originally factored. Then we had another one, is that we used this test called cambric that was done in the alluvium, very well characterized. That's why we're not going to talk about it so much today. But its conceptual model had this compressed zone, the blast and the shock wave, that kind of put a low permeability rind around the test and made it harder for radionuclides to get out. But 2 of our tests were in volcanic rock. Well, it turns out some other folks who've done underground nuclear testing elsewhere in the world discovered that when they did their test in their volcanic rock, you wound up with a zone of higher permeability, because of the fracturing in the shock wave. So we added a conceptual model for that. Kind of deviating from where we thought we were starting. Of course, this is the PEST conference, so we, of course, did have to calibrate a model. We did use PEST, and yeah, you read that number right. That's 30. Now, we had some other information on possible permeabilities. You'll notice immediately what's missing is where's our transport data? Where's information about tritium or uranium or anything? We didn't have that. And there's a bigger, I think, decision maker issue there, but the fact is that we didn't have it. We did scratch up some geochemical estimates of velocity. We were able, not surprisingly, to calibrate our model pretty well for flow. The number of adjustable parameters was much larger than the data. John visited us in the late aughts and took great pleasure in pointing this out. Not that we weren't aware of it, but that was kind of our remit. And I'm going to take a little diversion here because I don't want to encourage John by telling him he's right, but we came into this and it was kind of a bigger overarching, I like how Randy put it, sort of more of a social decision maker thing that we had to, because in the end, all that geology that I showed you really didn't matter, right? It didn't matter. But we had to prove that it didn't matter. Of course, that made it harder, the absence of evidence of absence thing, right? So we were kind of stuck with it. And we wound up with 20 different flow models. We had our discrete frameworks. We had to make our regulator happy. We had a dialogue with them, and we were fortunate that one of our regulators had a PhD in hydrogeology, and we could speak the language of uncertainty. So part of it was even if we didn't like the model, it's like Randy said, we had to keep it on the table because it was something they were like, well, what if you did this? What if you did that? So it was part of our suite. It's like, fine. We're not going to say that we like this one better or anything. It's more of that kind of concept of equifinality even, if you will, right? Fine. So we had 20 of these. Yeah, no data on radionuclide transport. More often than not, we could get nice looking plots. This is one that our colleague Nicole did, who unfortunately couldn't be with us. I was looking forward to seeing her here today. We could, get the bigger picture of, we had this sort of perchy system and a bigger underlying carbonated aquifer. The velocities, you'll notice, are extremely low. I'm glossing over some of the arguments and things that we had about that, but let's go on. So we did a bunch of those, and we did, as my friend John wants me to point out, we even did a null space Monte Carlo back in 2008 with these things. And on top of all that, the regulatory requirement was a probabilistic assessment of transport. They call this thing the contaminant boundary, that if 5 or more realizations out of 100, this is the 95th percentile, exceeded the MCL, that grid block or that area was counted as being of potential concern. So you see this, this sort of colorful montage here is all the different combinations of flow model and parameter uncertainty all together. There is a consistency here at pinstripe, that they tend to follow that strip of welded tuff. But the thing that was interesting, that particularly came out in the mid-aughts was, we got to have this, maximum likelihood model Bayesian averaging. Well, our regulator, this smart lady, she understood what it was and she didn't want it. She said, I don't want to see your best estimate. I want to see the flavor of all the different results. I want to see the good ones and the bad ones, or the ones that kind of seem the same. So back in this really excellent aging report, they have a great discussion about validation. And validation in this particular context isn't the validation of the numerics or the physics. It's, I've built a model for an application. I'm going to go out, I'm going to test that model, I'm going to go drill a well, I'm going to sample groundwater, take an elevation or concentration, and if that agrees within a certain tolerance, my model is good for all future applications. I never have to think about it again. That's really what it comes to. I mean, I might be a little hyperbole there, but I don't think so. And you can read the literature for yourself. I'm not gonna. I'll tell you more about it, but these guys talked about it and they said, this is not attainable. And our strategy had originally called for a validation. But by the late 2000s, the person who was mostly working on this had read the literature, was a very thoughtful person, wasn't really feeling it. So he's like, maybe we should do something different. And he grabbed a hold of this document, and there's a National Research Council companion document, and it talks about evaluation. And it talks about a whole ways to build confidence. Collecting new information, evaluating your forecasts, have a review. We had an internal review process and we had an external peer review. 2 of the reviewers, were supposed to be here, but I guess Jim couldn't make it, so only Charlie made it. Not only Charlie, sorry, Charlie. And then go back and change your mind if you have to. And you can read the regulatory language for yourself there. But by 2012, we'd reached this point where these 2 esteemed gentlemen had written that we should abandon these terms, but that doesn't mean that we should give up evaluating and thinking about our tools. And then we had a peer review. Like I say, Charlie and Jim were on it. Nicole, and there's Bruce, and Rob. It was open to the public. It was about building confidence and providing transparency. This was the Nevada test site during the Cold War, and there was a considerable veil of secrecy, to put it mildly, over its activities. There's a whole group of people in the US, they call themselves downwinders, that live downwind from this site and other nuclear sites, that believe that they were never really told the truth about what they were exposed to, and there's probably an element of truth there. So, there's some public skepticism. This was a member of the public, as I recall. So it was about putting all the cards on the table, showing everyone we had, what we were thinking, opening it up for criticism. Anyone could attend our meeting and just seeing what we had done. And in the end, mercifully, because I really had enough of this project by now, was to move on to the next stage. So now we're to a stage where I'd like to slow down here maybe a little bit. You can read the This is our regulatory language. This is the flow chart. I've dimmed out this part because this is kind of like paperworky part. This is the model evaluation and or refinement phase. So the idea is we're going to agree on things about the model, maybe that we'd like to test some more. We'll do some paperwork. Then we'll go get the data. We'll see how it changes what we think about it, everything. We'll show it to our internal review team. Do we need to do something else or change our mind? If so, go back. This isn't meant to be an infinite loop. I heard that, Keith. Prepare a report, and then the regulator holds the final decision if they want to go on or not. Not unsurprisingly, the regulator and the Department of Energy chose to drill wells at these two tests that had the biggest contaminant boundary. Why wouldn't you? I mean, the model is is telling you, our calculations are saying that these are the areas of the most transport, although arguably this isn't a lot of transport, but you know, again, secrecy, radiation, test site, right? So we drilled a well here and here. So how'd we do? Well, at Milkshake, this is the two cavity radii in the spiffy figure. This is the aquifer, this is the screen. We're about 100 meters away here. We had said that we were almost certain that we were going to exceed the MCL for tritium, 20,000 picocuries per liter. Well, there was a 2 in our number, but it really was just 2. But you know, on a multiple log scale, we're good. Right? So we were not wrong, we were conservative. We did notice though, in terms of rethinking, and we're gonna come back to this point, is, you know, we rethought, because we had thought that this was like a fractured rock type setting, you know, so we had low effective porosities, we had matrix diffusion, right? When we finally got the data back from the well, it was more like a rubble basalt. So if you know, it was probably really more like an effective porous media, and that's not an unreasonable explanation for why we saw this big difference. So how'd we do at Pinstripe? Well, it turns out we were right. When we drilled this well here, there's a fault in between it and the test, so that this piece of rock that we thought was continuous along the water table all the way out to the basin was not. It was broken. So that, you know, now this, you know, we are going to talk about conservatism versus wrong here shortly, but that's not a bad thing. You know, we learned something. You know, one slide for this particular topic wouldn't do it justice. And, you know, and like I say, John and his colleagues have written more pages on this than I can adequately summarize. But, you know, I'm sure you've all found out that when you're talking about an environmental problem, and particularly when it comes to radiation, which is very sensitive, you can't understate the problem. You know, I mean, this is an operating assumption. You want to err on the side of as somewhat worst case, but not terribly uncertain, as Doherty and Simmons say, you know, that if you do something that's demonstrably conservative and everything's still fine, then you can be done. There's a nuance here that the price tag, if this is something you're having to act, if you have to do something active, that price tag can be exorbitant. Right, but that's not what the point is here. So yeah, you don't want to understate the problem. There are a raft of other assumptions behind here that I haven't told you about. In the interest of brevity, like the leaping water, Keith. I can feel your eyes rolling from here. But you know, it's fine. You know, we want to walk about how we went through this because, you know, we did this modeling. And we got a decision, and it's been implemented, and I'm going to show it to you. So our regulatory language explicitly recognizes that we're allowed to be conservative. It also says that we want to develop sufficient confidence to use it to guide, not to be the final answer that, aha, this is the stake in the ground, you must meet it. So after a couple of years, because it takes a while to get things done, we did go to a decision. The review, we had drilled the wells, collected the information that you saw, discussed it with the regulators. All this is open. We recommended that we should go on and close the site, which is closure is kind of a holy grail, and particularly this particular project had been running for some time and is finally winding down, so that's a good thing. The review committee said that, yeah, we think you're done. You should go on. That you could monitor this and make decisions reasonably well. And I also like how they wrote, but they're also reminding everyone that it's about the whole conceptual understanding as well, not just the numerical calculations. This is where we're going to chat just a little bit about wrong versus conservative. The state wrote the DOE and says, that we want a new contaminant boundary for pinstripe. Everything else is adequate, and maybe that's not exactly ringing praise, but I was good with it. And why did we pick pinstripe? What's the difference between wrong and conservative, right? Well, so in Milkshake, we detected radiation. Not at the levels we thought, but like I said, there were other conservative assumptions built in there, and the lava aquifer was where we said it would be. So that was deemed to be conservative. It was okay. But at pinstripe, it really was just wrong. And that we had that boundary, if you remember, stringing out to the east. Well, you would never want to drill a well out there to look. That's just misleading. That's just wrong. Right, Keith? You were there. So we went ahead then, and we're going to do a revision to the pinstripe boundary based on what we learned from drilling the wells. I think that's, a good thing, generally speaking, right? You collect new information, you change your mind. And the interesting thing about this is I'm sure that you all have experienced this, is when you talk about uncertainty, everyone always assumes it's the worst. That uncertainty is always bad. In this case, it wasn't. It worked out well. So let's go on here. So we had to redo the conceptual model for pinstripe. This is looking east-west. So instead of flowing, transport going along this sort of little orangey piece of rock here, said no, it can't go that way. Can't go into the page. Can't come back to us because there are other reasons in the basin. There's another little perch basin here, so water kind of tends to come down this way. So it really does kind of have to go out here, for a few hundred meters through this rock and then out into alluvium, where it'll move at a meter per year for a long time. Yeah. And so, and the part that I was just reflecting on this morning, that I still think is funny, is we had 20 flow models. We had null space Monte Carlo. We had Monte Carlo on our transport parameters. That's how we got to this boundary. And in the end, you know how we did this? We pen whipped it. That's maybe a little harsh, but that's what we did. We looked at it and said, well, 2 cavity radii, groundwater moves about a meter per year. Done, close enough. I'm not really sure what to make of that still, but I feel good because, clearly we had exercised or had explored the studio space, right? No cowbell here, but explored the studio space enough that our regulator was fine with this simple calculation. But we had to go through everything else first. And I'm not really sure what to make of that still, but it was what it was. Okay. I can feel the hate from this topic already, particularly from that man over there. But, again, the National Research Council, they assert at the beginning of the dawn of the modeling era, so to speak, that was 33 years ago, that we should have QA. Now, the version of what form should that QA take, they touched on many different possibilities, and I don't even think that it's settled to this day. I would tell you that I don't think there's proof that a program will help you. I think a checklist will instill false confidence because you could have all the right input, but you could have the wrong conceptual model or applying all the right inputs the wrong way. I'm sure none of you have done that. I certainly never have. And of course, it could cost so much money that it actually impedes the work. Unfortunately for the DOE, we actually had a contractual obligation, and it sounds nice. Products and services meet or exceed customers' expectations or requirement. It's about 15% of the budget. EPA even thinks that model QA is important in some fashion. At the end of our peer review, we did do a QA audit of ourselves and then showed it to the regulator so that everyone could feel good that we were being transparent and doing the things we said that we would do. But both this project and myself are nearly done talking here. What they did with our contaminant boundaries was just draw these big boxes around them and say, you can't operate inside that, you can't drill wells, you can't do stuff in the ground without us knowing about it. You can't use drinking or irrigating crops, which is kind of peculiar out here, but okay. And the water's got to be clean if you intend to use it. There's one last component, though. That's fine for the Department of Energy, but it wasn't fine for the state. The state wants that line in the sand. They drew it roughly here at where the sort of lip of this alluvial basin spills into the carbonate system that goes on for many, many miles down to Death Valley and Devil's Hole and places like that. And the idea would be that we have this boundary and we're going to monitor here to try to protect the environment and people from exposure. Almost done. And now, just not that long ago, post-closure reports are now being written that monitoring wells are picked, sampling is being conducted, these kind of bigger negotiations have taken place, and post-closure, it's done. Which I think Keith at times thought was never going to happen. I'm going to call the project a success. We did get a decision. The Department of Energy got its closure. We got to have a technical say. It was given, and the regulators were allowed to contribute, and it was guided, the way that this problem was going to be managed. The Department of Energy management was kind of flexible and letting us kind of hash things out a little bit with the regulator to kind of build that rapport and to allow its technical team to think a little bit differently. There was some trust, they had to trust that we weren't just going down blind alleys, and finally, we got to the point where even the experts read it, that it was time to finish. Just need to put it all on the table. There was no amount of other calculations were going to be helpful. Heck, the way that I recall is that the peer review kind of told us that we'd done too much. But, we also had to try to satisfy everyone's concerns. We did have a highly trained, a very expert team with folks from Los Alamos and Livermore National Labs, the U.S. Geological Survey, Desert Research Institute, the prime contractor, and actually the NDEP, our regulatory agency, had, like I say, a PhD hydrogeologist on the staff, which is, kind of unusual. And we could have great conversations with her. And, our regulator really wanted to have success too. I mean, the public doesn't like it when a decision's not been made. It just seems like you're just going around and around and around. So they were interested in some success because, I think after some years of working with us, they became to realize, like we did, that this is not really a problem. But, we had to go through all this stuff, to show, part of it is, institutional mistrust, again, that veil of secrecy from the Cold War. And the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. And I've often wondered if we had drilled wells first to see what the contamination might have been from pinstripe or milkshake, that this would have been an easier process. But there were other institutional considerations. And finally, we started out with the poet, but I'd like to leave you some words from a scientist, from quite a while ago. And that's the story of Frenchman Flat. I thank you for your time. I'll answer any questions you have if at all possible. I am here. I won't tell the bathroom story right now, but I will tell it to you at break or this evening. Yes, sir.
I'm working with the NDP.
Oh, really?
So I know who reviewed your model. You last one slide definitely said something. You working with someone competent to regulate. I think that's pretty good in that sense. So one thing I definitely say, my experience with like NDP, we definitely not many modeler keep updated like this high advanced modeling technique. And also like we always follow some guidance. That's kind of normally when we review the model, we kind of, you mentioned the EPA, like a model evaluation. That's where we have a basis, when we review something, we always kind of use this like a step to follow that one. Another thing, definitely, like you mentioned the MCL, that's generally is how we, is kind of last defense. We have to make sure that this is meet. So like say, you have something, we have to say you have to get say everything in MCL kind of range. So but I say my question say not just with NDP. I'm sure you're working with many government agency. But what's your overall experience? Is a good experience, or is kind of say generally sometimes you probably get some question. I don't know, is it reasonable, or is you feel maybe too much?
I found NDEP to be the outlier. They were they wanted to make a decision that distinguished them from a place where I'm working now. Where they do not want to make a decision, most definitely, because you could be wrong, right? So and of course having Britt, was great. There's rarely do you encounter a regulatory agency with that depth of expertise. So it was kind of fortunate, really, in that sense. Charlie.
Greg, to put this in perspective for all of us, can you give us an estimate of how much time and money was required to get closure?
Well, so now, does that include well drilling?
What's that?
Why don't you tell me without well drilling and with well drilling?
Okay. So hang on and let me think here. So I'm casting my mind back. Like I said, I have not thought about this in a while, but I'm sure that this well and the one at Milkshake were at least $1.5 million. I got to remember, this is a Department of Energy site. Rad control is critical, even if there's no objective evidence that, in fact, there is any radiation. I think we probably, I know as the contractor, I think we spent probably over the several years. Does that include the peer review charges, Charlie? Because also there's also Livermore and Los Alamos. We had to pay Keith, Desert Research Institute, $10 million.
That's all.
Just guessing. Just certainly no less than that.
I'll just yell. So now that you can look back at this project, what do you think is, with the new tools that have been coming out over the last several years, what do you think would be the biggest impact of these new tools, and how where would that impact what you did?
Trevor, I don't think that the new tools would matter. I knew in 2008 that our system was way over parameterized for the information that we had, and that a lot of the choices that we were making was, okay, I think it's this, or maybe some chunk of a well log where we actually saw other things. There's all kinds of other, like, is there other, all kinds of things behind the scenes that I haven't shared with you. I don't think that the new tools wouldn't tell me what I didn't already know back then.
I have a question, but this is just alluding.
Well.
Let's stay. So, as order of like asking about new tools, Greg alluded to it when we talked about leaping water. Now, this is part of the conservatism where we're assuming the water is flowing along. It senses a nuclear test a couple hundred feet above it, leaps up, runs through the cavity, and drops back down in order to pick up the nuclides. So when you have that kind of conservatism thinking, it doesn't really matter what numerical tool you have. You're still going to do stupid things for a long time. And when you have an unlimited trough, why should you stop?
Yeah, so I mean, this is kind of peeling back and looking under the unsavory hood maybe a little bit, but firstly, this was a management decision, not a technical decision. I want to clarify that a test like this, here's the water table, a third of the way through it, the conservative assumption was all that inventory was available to the groundwater. Just take it and shove it all in the groundwater, done. And looking at and actually coming back to this test, one of the alternative conceptual models for what's really happening here is that there is no groundwater flow, but then we wouldn't have a program, and that radionuclide migration was diffusion only. I mean, that test has been there for 50 years. Tritium is pretty mobile in the environment, right? But again, I mean, we actually discussed that at one point, but like I say, the fact that there may not be actually any groundwater flow in Friendship Flat since the last pluvial period, 10,000 years ago, was not a conceptual model of interest. Well, thanks for your time, though. I'll be around if you want to chat about it. Oh.